Baskerville says, Anark, what's your view on anarcho-primitivism? Very negative. Very negative. I think that they're wrong in so many ways that it's hard for me to know where to start. First of all, they're wrong about technology. Technology is not inherently bad. Technology is not inherently authoritarian. Technology is a source of power, and power can be used in a variety of ways. So what I've said before, I did a video about technology where I kind of address anarcho-primitivism. Technology has both kind of a nature and a nurture to it, you might say. By its form, it kind of has some necessary implementation, but by its conditions and surroundings and context and the way that it is embedded in a social fabric, it will have different outcomes. So technology is not inherently bad. That's the first mistake. I mean, then before even moving on from that, there's also even trying to define what is technology. Where does technology begin and end? And they can't even seem to agree on that. Different primitivists seem to have different ideas of what is technology and where was the first technology? Is language technology? Is being able to start a fire technology? Is picking up a stick and smashing technology? You know, like, you'll notice that the boundary is very fuzzy. It doesn't mean that you couldn't define such a boundary, but it then becomes very difficult to discern what it is, what kind of state of existence we would have to return to satisfy people who are primitivists. I know I've heard some of them say that the beginning of agriculture was when everything went bad. I've heard some of them say that, you know, the development of weapons was when everything went bad. The boundary is fuzzy, and it's also not super important because technology is part of being a being with a higher concept of reality. If you can conceive of things that are not, you are eventually going to start developing more and more sophisticated technologies. It's Pandora's box. You're never putting it all back in the box. You're never going to eliminate the memory of how technology works. And any society that tries to persist without technology is going to be defeated or subsumed by a society that does utilize technology. And that society utilizes technology will probably be better in many ways to the society that refuses, just for simple quality of life improvements. Also, then you've got the other problem, which is that what is your praxis, yo? What is your praxis? What are you actually going to do to make that happen? Sabotage? Okay, cool. So I think that we barely even need to have a conversation to recognize that you are just advocating propaganda of the deed, or just more specifically, just open terrorism, which will lead to the death and immiseration of millions or billions of people. And yeah, I know I've heard the argument like, well, there's already so many people suffering every single day. And, you know, people are suffering under this system. And it's like, I agree, but it's certainly not going to be made better by you destroying the foundations of what allows many people to live. I think it's pretty obvious that this is ableist in its very nature, but you know, I actually agree with them on one point, and that is that in many indigenous societies, disabled people were actually treated to better standards of care than we now give them. They had a society around them to take care of them. They were integrated in a social fabric much more often. But the standards of medical care were much worse. In fact, people with a bunch of different disabilities would just simply die in the world that they're describing. And it just seems like there's very little wrestling with that I've noticed. I think that the reason why, I think that probably if I had to guess, they are wrestling with it in their minds and among themselves, but they don't want to do it in public because all of the discussions about what it would look like to bring about that society would probably be so abhorrent and horrifying to the average person or even the average radical that they know they sound like callous, people, that they sound like people who that do not care about the well-being of other human beings, and that are willing to sacrifice the well-being of other human beings to bring about something which honestly is not even a desirable end goal. That's not even it. Wow. It also seems to fetishize indigenous ways of living. It seems to just assume that if you eliminate technology, that you're just going to have like this utopic, harmonious society, and that you're just going to return to a horizontal way of living. And it's just false. The actual truth is that indigenous societies went every which way. There were indigenous societies that were deeply hierarchical and warlike, and absolutely went into processes of conquest with surrounding tribes. And it could be very brutal. And there were tribes that were very horizontal, which really look a lot like the kinds of things we might want to put in place. And it should be said, there were also horizontal tribes that were very warlike. In fact, the Iroquois Confederation, which many of us as anarchists look to as being a great example of indigenous anarchism or indigenous horizontal structures, was itself full of warring tribes or warrior tribes. Like, there were lots of warrior tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy, and it was to some degree contentious with its neighbors. It wasn't just like peaceful because it was horizontal either. I just think that it's not good to fetishize the state of nature, or I guess you might say pre-civilization, as somehow just being desirable because it lacked modern technology. It's complicated. In that state of existence, many different kinds of structures arose. And wow, I'm still going, but there's still more criticisms. Another criticism: if what you want to do is reproduce the conditions of a society before agriculture and a society before the rise of the state and all of that, you need to understand first that those are the very conditions that the state arose out of. It's not to say that every single place created states. It's not to say that every single tribe became a state. It is to say that those were the conditions that states arose and successfully conquered within. And so it's already been demonstrated that that state of existence does not resist against the rise of the state, because that is the very state of existence which produced the state. You can say, oh, we'll do it different this time. But I think that the reason it happened is not just because there was no conscious awareness that it could happen. There was. In fact, you can find plenty of indigenous tribes which were extremely aware of the possibility of hierarchy catalyzing into very dangerous sorts of formations, to the degree where they would conquer kings and overthrow corrupt chiefs and all kinds of stuff. The point I'm trying to get across is that it didn't prevent the state from rising. So trying to reproduce those conditions is, once again, trying to reproduce the conditions that we've already got confirmation produce the state. This is why when I look to the future, I'm not just looking backwards. I'm inspired by what has been done in many indigenous societies. I think that in many ways, their structures of social governance, even when they were hierarchical, were preferable. But I am looking to the future. I am not trying to reproduce a past that is gone. I'm trying to produce a future where we can all live. And that means that we have to use what we now have in order to create something that is resistant of the rise of the state once again. The state has to be prevented. It has to be actively countervailed through both structure, through culture, through individual ideological transformation, and through transformation of technology to be liberatory technology, both by changing its form and by changing its context within the social fabric. That's the only way that we're going to produce something which resists the recatalyzation of the state. We have to produce a social immune system. And what we can see is that those pre-civilizational forms did not successfully create this social immune system to prevent the spread of hierarchical power structures and conquering hierarchies. RD says, as a post-Civ anarchist, I respect your thoughts on the topic, but I just think that post-Civ really addresses the critiques you made of Anprim. Well, I saw, kind of like glanced over and saw you mention, you said that some Anprims are post-Civ, but having looked into both, I don't know if I agree with that characterization. It seems to me that these are opposite viewpoints. I think that some Anprims are anti-Civ, but I don't think any Anprims are post-Civ, because post-Civ seems to be more about taking pretty much kind of what I was saying, about taking the advancements of society and, building something, an alternative, or building something new out of it. It's about moving into the future, right? That's the post in post-Civ. Okay. Yeah. No, post-Civ is not, post-Civ doesn't seem to me to be commensurate with anarcho-primitivism. They seem like they disagree with each other. Post-Civ is not anti-technology, for example. Post-Civ is way more complicated. Seems like, pretty much my only issue with post-Civ is I don't like their obsession of the word civilization. I don't like how in both anti-Civ and post-Civ, they just define civilization as bad things. They seem to mean civilization as synonymous with the state and economic domination and authoritarianism or hierarchical power structures more broadly. And I just don't think that's a good description of civilization. I also think that it contains a bunch of the subtexts that I am personally a little uncomfortable with. One of these subtexts being that when imperialists came to, indigenous societies and called them quote unquote uncivilized, that this was an accurate characterization. I disagree. I think that they were civilized. They didn't practice the barbaric civilization of Western imperialism. And they looked quote unquote uncivilized because they hadn't taken on these dominating imperialist behaviors of the West. So I don't think that civilization should be made synonymous with the dominators. It almost seems to me like that's a compliment to the dominators. They're civilized. They're the ones that know how to manage a civil society. In their society, people are civil. I don't like any of those implications. I dislike all of those subtexts. And so I'm reticent to just sacrifice this word civilization to the authoritarians and to say that I don't want civilization, that I don't want a civil society, because I'm afraid of the word civilization. I'm not afraid of the word civilization. I just think that there's different kinds of civilizations and that there is such a thing as a civil society. And in many ways, a civil society is a good thing, a society where people practice civic behaviors towards one another. I think that's probably a good thing. People have to be able to practice respect, mutual respect and kindness and patience and so on. Those things are good. And that is, weird as it may sound, what is heavily associated with this phrase of civilization. Civilization to the vast majority of people and historic scholars until anti-Civ and post-Civ was largely associated with an organized society where there were basic foundations of social good, where we didn't accept things like murder and theft and abuse of others. So when you come to the normal person and even most scholars and you say, I'm against civilization, what they hear is, I don't think that we should have norms against murdering people. I don't think that we should have civic values. I don't think that we should practice mutual respect and coordination with people in society. I'm not saying that that's what post-civ people mean by it. I understand what they mean by it because I've now at least like kind of learned enough about their perspective. But I just don't vibe with using the word civilization in this way. I think it's both confusing and doesn't really match historical usage and doesn't even really match theoretical usage until it was made to mean this by anti-civ and post-civ people. So that's why I don't really use that phrase, post-civ. Aiden says, from what you said, Anprims seems like a different form of reactionary, as in to technology and related social problems, when centralization of power is more responsible, in my humble opinion. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a reason why primitivist spaces often have fascists in them. And that is because fascism is based a lot around around trying to reproduce an idyllic past. It's the belief that in the past there was some perfect, not, like flourishing society that needs to be reproduced. And that what we've got now is a degeneration of past values. And that we have to return, right? It's where all the jokes about return with the V and everything come from. Because there's the part of a key part of fascism is not only that you're a conservative, it is that you are regressive. You want to go backwards. And I think primitivists often give me those vibes. In fact, you want to read a primitivist who's got those vibes in spades, go read Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski is basically a primitivist fascist. Like he's constantly saying might makes right fascist stuff in his work. It disturbs me so much that anarchists cite him. He was not an anarcho-primitivist. He was like a fascist primitivist. And they're like, oh, well, his critiques of technology were good. And it's like, no, his critiques of technology also sucked. His critiques of industrialism were okay, but go find them elsewhere. Go find them elsewhere. There's no reason why y'all need to promote Ted Kaczynski. You're basically promoting a fascist. A fascist who, might I add, tried to murder innocent people who had literally done nothing. People working in colleges and secretaries and people flying planes. Dude just tried to murder innocent people with bombs. The hell's wrong with people? Confused Lefty says, if technology is neutral, but power structures build things, design cities, etc., in a way that furthers their power, is it actually neutral? Well, like I said, what I said kind of off the bat was that there's a sort of nature and nurture to technology. Okay. There's some aspect of the way that it's constructed that makes it to where it can only produce certain outcomes. So some technologies are very constrained in the outcomes they produce, and some technologies are extremely broad. So let's look, for example, at the firearm. The firearm is an example of a technology that is built in a very specific way. It can only do a thing, and that is shoot a bullet. And what's that meant to do? Harm people. Maybe scare them. Harm people. But now look at its nurture. Well, the gun can also be used for self-defense. Harming people has a context, right? It can be done in an aggressive way, which harms, is a violation of others. But it can also be done in a way which prevents the violation of others. So the firearm, something with you might say a nature or a form or a structure, inherent structure, which gives it the constraint of shoot, bullet, and kill, is not strictly bound to be bad when it is embedded in a different context. But now we can look at things like social media. Social media has an inherent structure, and much of it is meant to distract us. It's meant to chew up as much of our free time as possible. And whether it's intended or not, it also tends to shallow our attention span. It tends to get us dopamine addicted. Those are part of its form. It's structured that way. Okay? And there's no way you could take that form as built and make it do anything else. Its structure determines that usage. Now you could tinker with its structure and it may slowly take on a different characteristic. And it should also be said, insofar as we're talking about its nurture or its context, we can see that actually social media has been used for liberatory purposes as well. In fact, there's a reason why during the Arab Spring that almost all those governments banned Facebook. Like, much as we might hate Facebook, Facebook was helping the masses create a huge bottom-up coup in these nations. So even though we've already accepted that Facebook has those negative qualities, it still, within certain contexts, can produce good outcomes. So what I'm saying is it's really complicated, extremely complicated. Technologies do have certain structural imperatives to them based on how they are constructed. But how they are embedded in circumstances also determines the scope of their possible usage. And part of that is how they're embedded in a social fabric. Is it a liberatory social fabric? Is it oppressive? Those things are important. So I hope that made sense. You could use so many different examples to inspect this. And what you're going to find is that there are varying levels of, I use this phrase, these words loosely, nature and nurture to technology, right? There are varying levels of inherent structure and contextuality. And it depends on which thing you were looking at specifically, what the conditions are for that piece of technology.